Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. DirecTV. Right now they have a super offer, $19.99 a month for 12 months with a 24-month agreement. DirecTV is a truly superior alternative to cable with access to over 285 channels and DirecTV's most advanced HD DVR system ever. And right now, 3 months free of HBO, Showtime, Stars, and Cinemax with the Select through Ultimate packages. Watch anytime your favorite true crime, like Investigation Discovery, The First 48 Hours, On the Case with Paul Lazon, Crime and Investigation, and my all-time favorite, American Justice. That's in addition to all the latest television programs, the biggest movies, and the very best in sports programming, offering amazing bundles and amazing savings. So call 1-855-980-3812 and switch to DirecTV today. $19.99 a month for 12 months with 3 free months of your favorite channels. DirecTV, 1-855-980-3812. 22-year-old Tim McLean had taken a job with the Red River Exhibition in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and then traveled to work as a carnival barker in Edmonton. Once there, though, he decided rather to return home. He departed Edmonton at 12:01 a.m. on July 30th, 2008, on board Greyhound Bus 1170 to Winnipeg, via the Yellowhead Highway through Saskatchewan. He sat at the rear, 1 row ahead of the washroom. At around 7 p.m., the bus left from a stop in Erickson, Manitoba, with a new passenger, Vincent Weiguang Li. Tim McLean sent a text message around 7:30 p.m. to his father, Tim Sr., as the bus was leaving Brandon, the last leg of its journey, to ask whether he could come there for the night. His father was happy to hear from him and texted back to his son that of course he could. Vince Weiguang Li was born April 30th, 1968, in Dandong and grew up in northeastern China in the province of Liaoning, living with an older brother, a younger sister, and his parents. In 1992, Li graduated from the University of Wuhan Institute of Technology with a Bachelor of Science degree in computers. And from 1994 to 1998, he worked in Beijing as a computer software engineer. Li and his wife, Anna, immigrated to Canada on June 11, 2001. Li had studied as a computer engineer for 4 years in China, but could not immediately find a job in his field in Canada. Li was hospitalized in early 2004 after an incident where he was picked up by Ontario Provincial Police, who found him walking along a highway following the sun on order from God. He was hospitalized briefly but never sought medical help afterwards. He worked in Winnipeg at Grant Memorial Church as a caretaker for 6 months later that year in 2004. He seemed happy to have a good job and was committed to doing it well, despite a language barrier he encountered with other congregation members. There were no incidents, however, but Li quit the job in spring of 2005. He also worked in Winnipeg as a forklift operator, while his wife worked as a waitress. Li moved to Edmonton in 2006, abruptly leaving his wife alone in Winnipeg. She joined him later that year. He became a Canadian citizen on November 7th of that year. His jobs included a supervisor at a McDonald's restaurant, a newspaper carrier, an employee at Meatland Foods, and at Walmart. He was prone to unexplained absences from work and sometimes took long road trips on the bus while offering friends and family members long, rambling talks. Li's former wife said he used to be gone for long periods of time. He took unexplained bus trips and sometimes rambled. Despite the urging of those close to him, he refused to seek medical treatment. At the end of June, he was fired from Walmart following a disagreement with other employees. Shortly after, Li asked for time off from his new delivery job to go to Winnipeg for another job interview. At approximately 12:30 a.m. on Tuesday, July 29th, 2008, Li boarded a Greyhound bus in Edmonton, Alberta, heading to Thunder Bay via Winnipeg. He purchased his ticket under the name of Wong Pent. He did not notify his ex-wife that he was leaving, nor what his destination was. He did leave her a note stating, "I'm gone. Don't look for me. I wish you were happy." Before the trip, he bought a very large knife at a Canadian Tire store. On July 29th, around 6 p.m., Li got off the bus in Erickson, Manitoba, with at least 3 pieces of luggage. Although the bus driver, Patrick Delbridge, tried to advise him that it was not his stop. Li stayed the night awake, sitting on a bench next to a grocery store. He spent 24 hours in Erickson, as there was only one bus per day stopping in the community. During that time, he disposed of most of his personal assets by either selling them or burning them. On the morning of July 30th, still at the bench, he sold his new laptop computer to a 15-year-old boy, Darren Beatty, for $60. Li had made a sign asking for $600, but Darren talked him down somehow to $60. Shortly before 6 p.m., Li boarded the bus heading to Winnipeg carrying Tim McLean and 35 other passengers. Tim McLean got off the bus for a cigarette break between Brandon and Portage-la Prairie. Li, 40 years old, a tall man with a shaved head and sunglasses, originally sat near the front of the bus, but moved to sit next to McLean following the rest stop. McLean barely acknowledged Li and proceeded to fall asleep against the window pane, headphones on. McLean was slim and fit, 5'5" and around 125 pounds. At around 8:30 p.m., Greyhound Bus 1170 was approximately 12 miles west of Portage-la Prairie on the Trans-Canada Highway when a passenger sitting one row ahead heard a blood-curdling scream and turned around to see Li standing over McLean, stabbing him repeatedly in the neck and chest with a huge Rambo-type knife. Tim McLean fought hard and tried his best to escape, but couldn't as Li was blocking the aisle. Li was preoccupied with McLean by now and continued to stab him as he lay on the floor. He paid no attention to the other passengers as the bus was vacated, and he appeared oblivious to the demands of bus driver Bruce Martin that he stop stabbing McLean. After everyone had run from the vehicle, Li came to the front of the bus and tried to escape. The bus driver was able to close the door on Li's arm with the bloody knife extended. Li pulled his arm back into the bus and returned to the rear, where he continued defiling the body of Tim McLean. Martin called 911. Bernie Skyrup, driver of a second Greyhound bus that was following Greyhound Bus 1170 to carry the passenger overload realized that there was something very unusual in the fashion that driver Martin pulled over and abruptly stopped. Mr. Surkrup stopped his bus on the shoulder right in front of Greyhound Bus 1170. Surkrup observed Li at the back of the bus and entered the bus yelling repeatedly for Li to stop the attack. Li responded by stating, "Get emergency." As Surkrup stared, Li was severing the head of Tim McLean. Surkrup left the bus as he realized McLean was dead and couldn't be saved. Li traveled to the front of the bus now, holding the severed head of Tim McLean in one hand and a black-handled knife in the other. The bus door was closed and barricaded by a truck driver who had pulled over to assist. Shortly after 8:30 p.m., Ken Barker and other RCMP officers responded to a call about a man brandishing a knife on a Greyhound bus on the Trans-Canada Highway near Portage-la Prairie. Upon RCMP arrival, a police vehicle was parked against the doors to the bus to prevent Li from exiting. They arrived to find Li being prevented from escaping by another passenger, the bus driver, and a truck driver, who had provided a crowbar and a hammer as weapons. The other passengers were huddled at the roadside, some of them crying and others vomiting. At one point, Li was fiddling with the bus controls, trying to open the door so that he could exit the bus. Driver Surkrup cut the power. Li threw the head of Tim McLean into the stairwell and returned to the back of the bus and continued to mutilate the body of Tim McLean. RCMP Corporal Harder attempted to communicate with Li and asked him to drop the knife out of a small window located in the bathroom at the rear of the bus. Li's only response was words to the effect that he had to stay on the bus forever. As officers watched, Li continued to mutilate both the body and the head and the face of Tim McLean, using both a huge knife and a pair of scissors. Constable Brown and Corporal Smith witnessed Li smell and then eat pieces of Tim McLean's flesh and lick blood from his fingers and hands. Li carried McLean's internal organs and various body parts throughout the bus. He grabbed McLean's head from the stairwell, holding it by the hair and shaking the decapitated head, taunting police. At approximately 1:20 a.m., 4 hours after the attack, July 31st, Li broke a window on the bus and threw out some personal belongings, a knife, and a pair of scissors. He then jumped out of the bus head first, landing on top of the knife. He was struggling, screaming, and refused to surrender his hands. Police stunned him with a taser numerous times before he surrendered his hands and could be handcuffed and taken to a police vehicle. Found in Li's pants pocket was a plastic bag containing Tim McLean's ear, nose, and tongue. Li, blood smeared around his mouth and on his face, pleaded with police, "I'm sorry. I'm guilty. Please kill me." The internal organs were recovered in plastic bags in 4 separate areas of the bus. The tip of the blade was found in McLean's skull in the forehead area just above the inner aspect of the right eyebrow. Tim McLean's eyes were missing, as well as a good portion of his heart, and were presumed eaten. Vincent Li was formally arrested. The story reverberated throughout the world, disgusting, shocking, and horrifying everyone that heard or read about the incredible killing. Days later, when he appeared in a Portage-la Prairie courthouse on charges of second-degree murder, the only words Li uttered were pleas for someone to kill him. The second-degree murder trial of Vincent Li began on March 3, 2009. Although Li had admitted his guilt to officers that night in 2008, Li pleaded not guilty. His lawyers argued that he was not criminally responsible because he was mentally ill. At trial, a psychiatrist said that Li believed the voice of God was telling him to do it. The court heard that Vincent Li believed the voice of God was telling him to kill Mr. McLean, and that by mutilating his body and eating parts of the flesh, he would prevent him from coming back to life. The voice told Vincent Li to get on the bus and sit next to Tim McLean. Dr. Stanley Yaren told Li's second-degree murder trial jury. Yaren is the head of Manitoba's forensic psychiatry program, and he said Li was delusional, believing God had told him to board the bus carrying a concealed knife. Yaren said it appeared Li sat beside McLean merely because the young man offered him a friendly greeting. A voice from God told him Mr. McLean was a force of evil and about to execute him, Yaren told the judge. Li believed he had to act quickly to protect himself. In response to that, in a state of panic and fearful for his own life, he carried out the acts that he did. But Li believed the 22-year-old McLean was still capable of coming back to life, so he continued to mutilate the body and scatter the parts around the bus. Mr. Li did not understand he was killing an innocent bystander. He did not understand his actions were wrong. Yaren said Li is still psychotic and believes it's just a matter of time before God kills him. He continues to have hallucinations and hear voices, but is on strong antipsychotic medication. Vincent Li is as much a victim as Tim McLean, the psychiatrist stated. It would be in some sense easier if Mr. Li was an antisocial psychopath with a history of malicious behavior, but he isn't that. He is, as I've come to know him, a decent person. Again, he is as much a victim of this horrendous illness as Mr. McLean was a victim. No one who witnessed the horror was called to testify, other than the two psychiatrists. McLean's family and friends, many wearing T-shirts with his picture on them, wept openly as the grisly details were read out in court. Tim McLean's mother, Carol DeDaly, has said she wants the law changed so anyone found not criminally responsible for a crime still serves time behind bars. Carol DeDaly told CBC News prior to the trial that she does not want to see Li ever released from custody. But legal experts say the not criminally responsible defense is rarely used, and it doesn't mean the criminal walks away scot-free. Yaren told the courts that Li was briefly hospitalized in 2004 after he was picked up by Ontario Provincial Police, who found him walking along a highway following the sun on order from God. He was, however, not diagnosed as a schizophrenic at that time, nor was he prescribed medication, and he did not contact mental health officials afterwards. At trial, Dr. Jonathan Rutenberg said Vincent Li was psychotic and was in no state to tell the difference between right and wrong. The attack was sudden and came as Li caught a glimpse of the sunlight and heard God's voice telling him that McLean was a threat. The voice said, "Do it now. If you don't, he's going to kill you." Now, 2 days later, on March 5th, 2009, trial lasted 2 days and heard from only two witnesses. Both were psychiatrists who testified Li suffered and suffers from schizophrenia. They testified Li heard what he thought was the voice of God a little over a year ago, telling him to kill McLean or risk being killed himself. Vincent Li was found not criminally responsible for the gruesome murder and beheading of Tim McLean on a Greyhound bus in summer of 2008. These grotesque acts are appalling, Justice John Scurfield said in Thursday's ruling. However, the acts themselves and the context in which they were committed are strongly suggestive of a mental disorder. He did not appreciate the act he committed was morally wrong. He believed he was acting in self-defense and that he had been commanded by God to do so. Both the Crown prosecutor and the defense agreed that Li is a schizophrenic who was suffering a psychotic episode when he killed the 22-year-old Tim McLean. Li, who is now 41 years old, will now be remanded to a secure psychiatric facility where he will receive treatment. A review panel will decide in the next 6 weeks which facility he will be transferred to, depending on whether he is considered a risk to others or to himself. His case must also be reviewed on an annual basis by a mental health review board. The review board will look at police reports from the crime scene and review transcripts of previous hearings, while also listening to evidence from psychiatrists who will treat Li about his current mental condition and his treatment plan and prognosis. The public needs to know that when a person is found not criminally responsible, it does not automatically follow that a person will be released into the community, Judge Scurfield said in his ruling. People who are found not criminally responsible but who continue to pose a danger to the community may be kept in a locked institution for the rest of their lives. After the trial, legal analyst and criminal lawyer Stephen Skirka said the decision shows that the Canadian criminal justice system is humane and recognizes that those in psychotic states cannot distinguish right from wrong. We can't simply look at the actions. We have to look at his mental state. We don't punish people who don't appreciate the nature and quality of their actions. I think that's a very positive feature of our system. With the not criminally responsible declaration, Li will not have a criminal record. But on the agreement of both the prosecutor and the defense, his DNA will be put into a registry so that it will be on file in the event Li is one day released and is suspected of another crime. Skirka said it's a responsible position for the defense to take because clearly they're concerned about public safety. While the McLean family knew to expect Thursday's ruling, McLean's mother, Carol Diddley, says she will push forward with what she calls Tim's Law. She wants those who are found to be not criminally responsible to have criminal records and to be treated in prison, not in a mental facility. Diddley told reporters outside the courthouse that NCR should be changed to what she calls NPA. That would be not psychologically accountable, but still criminally responsible. Because a crime was committed here, a murder still occurred, and not criminally responsible seems to negate that fact. She also wondered why Li, who was born in China, was granted citizenship even after he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. The thing is, though, that he was arrested by police and hospitalized in 2004 for walking towards the sun on order from God. However, he was not diagnosed at that time as schizophrenic. The Li case brought mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, into the national headlines, and some psychologists say the trial had reinforced the stigma attached to mental illness. Annette Osted of the College of Registered Nurses of Manitoba told CTV that it's time to stop blaming Vincent Li and start searching for answers about what went wrong in the health system. His illness, left untreated, caused this horrific event. Now, why was it left untreated, she asked. That's a factor we have to look at as a society. Dr. Richard Shore says that schizophrenics have more to fear from society than vice versa. He said the majority of people with illness do not act violently. It's rare for schizophrenics to express outward aggression. They are usually more isolated. Mary Alberti of the Schizophrenia Society of Ontario said that with Tim's Law, we understand why the family would take that viewpoint, but we also know based on experience at the Schizophrenia Society that the outcomes with treatment can be very good. With proper treatment, Mr. Li will have greater insight into his disease, but having said that, we have to remember schizophrenia and psychosis are characterized by having a lack of insight that they are ill, she said. But with proper treatment and support, we believe people can recover from schizophrenia. Tim McLean's family lobbied for changes to the criminal code, pushing for victim protection legislation they called Tim's Law. And by signing the petition for Tim's Law, people were showing support for a dialogue that weighs the rights of all sides of the discussion. The proposed legislation would prevent a person found not criminally responsible of a crime from being released into the community. It would mean that the most violent, unpredictable people who have committed a crime would face incarceration for life, with no possibility of release. During this time, Carol DeLaley found work cleaning houses at night. She also had to give that up to help care for her grandkids, including her own Tim McLean's child, who was born 5 months after Tim's death. Carol says her family's long legal battle to keep her son's killer locked up has left them struggling to stay afloat financially. She says that the fight has stunted her career growth, saw her lose out on income, and forced her and her husband, Tim, to rack up debt, and that they were pretty much at the end of their resources. The DeLaley says she was forced to miss work for extended periods of time as she attended hearings and dealt with legal issues related to Vince Lee's trial. The DeLaley has fought the verdict of not criminally responsible ever since, and the recent decision to potentially move Lee to a group home. Her family also filed a lawsuit against Greyhound and the federal government for failing to take proper safety precautions. Tim McLean's uncle, Dave Melkowski, created a GoFundMe for the couple earlier this month, which raised more than $6,000. Melkowski says that DeLaley had been totally consumed by the horrible tragedy and asked for help in getting their lives back. Now, 5 years later, 1,200 people had signed her petition, the Tim's Law. She said it was a tough decision to close the DeLaley Foundation for life after accepting donations for the effort, but it had become a financial drain. Still, she said she believes she had made an impact. She wanted to make people aware, and she thought that she had done that to the best of her ability. I have brought to the attention of the leaders of the country, the policy makers. There was a lot of information, a lot of talk that didn't exist 5 years ago. A killer is a killer. If you take a life, you forfeit your freedom for the rest of your life, she said. The only thing that should change with a mentally ill killer is that they should serve their sentence in a place where they can also receive treatment. As a result, Prime Minister Stephen Harper of the Conservative government announced proposed changes to the criminal code that would include stringent restrictions for people found not criminally responsible for violent crimes. Among the changes the Prime Minister has outlined was a new legal designation, high-risk, non-criminally responsible accused. Offenders given that designation would be ineligible for unescorted passes and would also have to wait 3 years before getting a review by mental health boards, as opposed to the annual review. The review boards would also have to follow stricter guidelines, and only the courts would have the power to revoke that status. The changes were also expected to include a bigger role for victims at every stage as soon as trials were completed. In June 3rd, 2010, in the first of annual hearings into Vincent Li's progress, the Criminal Code Review Board ruled he can take walks on hospital grounds as long as he is escorted by 2 staff members. The passes started at 15 minutes and increased incrementally to a maximum of 1 hour, twice daily. At that time, the Manitoba Attorney General Andrew Swan stepped in and put the decision on hold until new security measures at the facility were implemented. A year later, June 3rd, 2011, the review board decided to allow Li to spend up to a full day outside the locked unit on the hospital grounds. He needed to be accompanied by 1 staff member only. The board did not authorize group outings on the grounds, nor did it allow him escorted passes into the community. By May 17th in 2012, less than a year later, Li was allowed escorted trips into the community of nearby Selkirk, about 50 miles from Winnipeg. The passes started at 30 minutes and increased incrementally to a maximum of a full day. Li would have to be escorted at all times by 1 staff member and a security officer. Further, he is allowed to make supervised full-day trips further afield to Lockport, another nearby community, Winnipeg, and nearby beaches. The board also approved Li for unescorted trips on the grounds of the mental hospital, starting for 15 minutes at a time and working up to a full day. In February 27, 2014, Li was allowed to leave the mental hospital without an escort and visit Selkirk on his own. The board ruled he could start with 30-minute visits and increase to full days. Supervision on his outings to the city of Winnipeg and local beaches was to be relaxed, and he was allowed to be moved to an unlocked ward at the hospital. Doctors from the Selkirk Mental Health Facility told the Criminal Review Board hearing that Vincent Li has made significant progress in his treatment. Indeed, the risk of Li reoffending, according to his medical handlers, is only about 1%. Based on this new diagnosis, the Review Board was asked to give Li extended privileges within the facility. Previously, Li was allowed passes to walk on hospital grounds, provided he had direct supervision. Now, doctors are suggesting Li is doing so well with the daily 60 to 90-minute walks that he should be allowed general supervision like any other patient at the hospital. A second proposal was made involving Li being permitted to take 30-minute excursions away from the hospital within Selkirk, provided he is accompanied by all times by a peace officer and a nurse. As doctors say, those passes can be extended by up to 15 minutes per week, provided there are no incidents, and he continues to make great strides. Within the request to the board, there was no indication that the community would be made aware of Li's presence in their neighborhood. In fact, his doctor suggested that the accompanying peace officer should be allowed to wear plain clothes to avoid drawing extra attention to Vincent Li. At the hearing, the prosecutor did not raise any opposition to the proposals. Li was described as having a low risk of reoffending and described as a nice, gentle guy. Ironically, Vincent Li sat quietly through the hearing, shackled in leg irons. It is expected that Vincent Li will be given more freedom in the days to come. The board is expected to render their decision shortly. Mental health advocates agreed it is unusual for a patient such as Li to get unsupervised leave after only 5 years in treatment. Manitoba Schizophrenia Society Executive Director Chris Somerville said typically patients are in treatment for much longer before having such freedoms, but Li is not typical. Yes, it comes as a surprise that it would be so soon, Somerville said, but he's done so wonderfully as a patient. Somerville said it's similar to giving children more privileges as they earn more trust. The average length of stay in a forensic unit is somewhere around 10 to 15 years on average, but this is unusual in light of the fact that he has responded so well to medication and treatment. In July 2014, one of the Mounties who responded to the 2008 Manitoba bus beheading, Corporal Ken Barker, committed suicide after years of suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Corporal Barker was a Mountie for 27 years, except for a brief stint with the Winnipeg Fire Department. For the latter part of his career, he was a dog handler, working with AXA, a Czech Republic-born German Shepherd. But as one of Manitoba's few dog handlers, he worked irregular hours, frequently uncovering decaying corpses in the wilderness. On the night of July 30th, 2008, Corporal Barker and AXA were among those called to the Trans-Canada Highway near Portage-la Prairie after reports of a stabbing on a Greyhound bus. He was one of the first police officers on the scene. Family and former colleagues said the 51-year-old Barker, who retired last month, had already seen almost 2 decades of horrific crime scenes when he witnessed the grisly scene on the bus. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, his estranged wife Sherry said. While family members say the beheading was the most traumatic incident Barker witnessed, the former officer said it wasn't the only one. Walter said her brother's treatment was coming along, and while he was still a dog handler, he was stationed at the airport and bus depots instead of responding to slayings. But last fall, things began changing. Barker, who had 2 adult children, had been on medical leave since October 2013. With Vincent Li getting in the paper about his walks, he started experiencing flashbacks, she said. Ken always said he didn't want to be known as the Greyhound guy, Sherry said. He said it first started at his first posting in Nanaimo, BC. The Greyhound incident was just one of many. It was multiple, cumulative, and he was just a sensitive fellow. He was predisposed because of his nature. 2 women rescued Barker from a suicide attempt in May, but no one got to him in time that weekend in July. Corporal Barker was found dead in his basement of his Manitoba home. He had recently retired and was estranged from his wife Sherry, who he met in high school. She arrived at the house to find the front door open, then called paramedics after finding no one on the upper floors. It was a very rapid decline in the last 6 months. He sent text messages like, "I think I'm too broken to ever be fixed." And he would also say, "I wish I had cancer, because then people would understand." February 23rd, 2015, experts recommend the board allow Vincent Li to be transferred to a Winnipeg hospital health sciences center with an eye to moving him to a community group home. Li's psychiatrist and other doctors also recommend Li be granted unescorted outings in Winnipeg. Dr. Stephen Kremer said Li has suffered no hallucinations in the past year and understands the importance of taking his medication. Kramer said Li's likelihood to reoffend violently is quite low. February 27th, the Manitoba Criminal Court Review Board allows Li to have unescorted visits to Winnipeg. On May 8th, 2015, the man who beheaded a fellow passenger on a Greyhound bus in Manitoba has been approved to move from a mental hospital to a group home in Winnipeg. A public rally against the ruling will be held Saturday afternoon at the Manitoba Legislature called Justice for Tim McLean. McLean's mother, Carol Diddley, says she will attend. My heart drops because this is solidifying my fear that I've had since the beginning of this. I've been trying to make people aware of the fact that this individual is going to be walking amongst us again. And it's just now that he's actually going to be out in the neighborhood that people are starting to hear what I've been saying. Recently, the board dealt with a request from the hospital to increase privileges for Mr. Li so that the hospital could grant an extended pass to reside at a Level 5 group home in the city of Winnipeg. John Stefaniak, chair of the Manitoba Criminal Code Review Board. At a hearing at the board in February, doctors recommended he move to a psychiatric unit at Winnipeg's Health Sciences Center and with continuous assessment, possibly be allowed to move to a Level 5 group home in Winnipeg. It's not known if Li has yet made the move or what the location of the facility where he may be staying. Stefaniak said a Level 5 group home typically has 24-hour staffing, supervision, and administration of medication, and at the very least, a curfew. Chris Somerville is the CEO of the Schizophrenia Society of Canada, Executive Director of the Schizophrenia Society of Manitoba, and he considers himself a friend of Vincent Li's. He has conducted the only interview Vincent Li has ever granted to media. This is an interview with the producers of Vice, HBO news program Vice, and Chris Somerville. What is your relationship to Vince Li? Chris Somerville. It's been a relationship of rapport and developing a friendship, providing self-help services to him, peer support service, and helping him understand his mental illness. Basically being a non-therapeutic person for him. Everybody's asking him therapeutic questions. He needs somebody that can just talk to him as a person, one-on-one. Vince Li's psychiatrist from the Selkirk Mental Hospital, Dr. Stephen Kremer, says Li runs a low risk of reoffending once back in the community. What does that really mean? It means the psychiatrist does risk assessment. What they evaluate is whether or not he has insight into his illness, and he does have insight into his illness. They also evaluate whether he is compliant with his medication and understands the need to take the medication, which he is and does. Also, we assess whether he has any addiction problems, which he doesn't. And does he have any sociopathic traits? And he doesn't. He's an ideal patient. He hasn't had any altercations with any of the patients since he's been at the Selkirk Mental Health Center for 6 years, so he's really an ideal patient. How can psychiatrists be sure that Li will not kill again once he's back in the community? They do that risk assessment, and they do the best they can. We know that recidivism rates are very low, and they do psychological exams. His chances of reoffending are less than 1%. On average, people who are released from the forensic unit who are found not criminally responsible, their recidivism rates are about 7.5%. Mr. Li's is less than 1%. Because he's doing so well. When Li is reintegrated into community, what kind of system will be in place to ensure he is taking his medication? Chris Somerville. He will probably be released conditionally, which means there will be conditions on his discharge. That means where he will live, who he will hang out with, who he has to meet, and staying away from the victim's family. He'll be monitored in terms of his medication through regular appointments. What happens if Li stops taking his medication after he's released? Well, he's learning how to monitor that, just like how at the Schizophrenia Society of Canada we teach patients how to know when there's warning signs that they might be deteriorating, where there's beginning signs of psychosis. You just don't become psychotic in a moment or overnight. There's warning signs that build up to it. He will learn those warning signs just like people who learn how to manage their chronic illnesses. People who have other chronic illnesses, Parkinson's, epilepsy, MS, they learn their signs and symptoms. Mr. Li will learn them as well. He has learned that, and he'll know when he needs to check with his doctor. He won't be psychotic at that point. He'll just realize he needs additional help. Should members of his soon-to-be community be afraid of Li? No. I don't think people in the community should be afraid of him. I have a brother with schizophrenia, and if he was doing as well as Vince Li, that would be great. He laughs. Why has the public responded so negatively to the idea of Li's release? The primary reason they are up in arms about it or alarmed about it is because of the brutal nature of how Mr. Li killed Tim McLean. If he had just shot him, we wouldn't even be talking. It was a unique, one-of-a-kind, first-ever type murder in Canada in which Li ate Tim McLean's body parts. Secondly, the public is concerned about his release because, well, they say, how do you make sure, how do you guarantee that he'll stay on his medication? What does the public's response to the idea of Li's potential release say about how we, the public, treat people with mental illness? It tells us that the Canadian public, number one, is not informed about the review board, what it does, and the risk assessment process. They are not informed about the statistics about recidivism rates and that those statistics are very low. It also tells us that many people do not believe in the concept of not criminally responsible. In other words, they don't believe in such a designation. They believe that if you kill somebody like Tim McLean the way that Vince Li did, that it was a criminal act and that you were criminally responsible. They don't believe in the designation NCR because of a mental disorder. That perpetuates stigma, so it buys into people's fears and their own social prejudice. It confirms their stigmas that they've seen on television or Hollywood movies. Because most people portrayed as mentally ill in Hollywood movies or even children's cartoons, most of these are portrayed as being violent and untreatable. People watch television and it simply confirms to them these people are Looney Tunes, crazy psychos that do not ever recover. You're not going to explain mental illness to people like that who don't understand the science about mental illness. It's fruitless to try to convince them. Heidi Rimke, an associate professor of sociology at the University of Winnipeg, agrees societal prejudices play a significant role in the demonization of Vincent Li. Rimke has written extensively about Li and how his case relates to the broader trend she calls bloodlust justice. It's a term she uses to articulate capitalizing on the emotional, especially fear, resentment, paranoia, and anger. Rimke says the media's handling of the case contributes to the heated rhetoric surrounding Li and argues that experts on the subject are not included in the discussion. But who do they put on the mainstream media? The mother. There's a reason why victims' families don't participate in the justice process. They're biased, Rimke says. I'm not saying don't let her speak, but be measured. It's irresponsible. At a hearing at the board in February, doctors recommend Vincent Li be moved to a psychiatric unit at Winnipeg's Health Sciences Center, and with continuous assessment, possibly be allowed to move to a level 5 group home in Winnipeg. It's not known if Li has yet made the move or the location of the facility where he may be staying. A level 5 group home typically has 24-hour staffing, supervision, and administration of medication, and at the very least, a curfew. You've been listening to True Murder. I'm talking about the Greyhound Bus cannibal killer, the definition of insanity.